Okay, we are live.
All right, good morning and welcome to the Vermont House Environment Committee. This morning, we are going to be learning about PFAS from the Director of the Waste Management and Prevention Division at DEC. Welcome, Ben.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. As Chair Sheldon said, I'm Matt Chapman. I'm the Director of the Waste Management and Prevention Division. So this is a general overview of issues surrounding PFAS. It's sort of broken into two parts. One is sort of like an introduction and an overview of what we call the Vermont PFAS roadmap, sort of what the agency's doing to identify and manage PFAS in the environment. For some of you, this may be sort of a refresher. For new members, it'll hopefully be give you some context.
Before you start,
Yes.
wouldn't mind just letting members know what you oversee in your division.
I would be happy to, yes. So I am in charge of the Waste Management and Prevention Division here and basically oversee solid waste, so landfills and illegal disposal of trash and other materials. Hazardous waste, which is sort of the more toxic end of contamination, underground and above ground storage tanks for both motor fuel and heating fuel. So making sure that there's not releases and then cleaning up those releases when they happen. And then the sites management program, which is the program that is the state equivalent of the Superfund program at the federal level that deals with releases of toxic substances into the environment. And then lastly, the emerging contaminants and residuals program, which basically is sort of, it manages the land application of biosolids, which we'll talk about in the context of this presentation, but also is sort of the place where we're working on building out a pollution prevention and emerging contaminants program to help small businesses understand some of the challenges that are being faced by some of these new and emergent contaminants that are coming along. So that's sort of my area. You know, I kind of help coordinate PFAS issues internally within the agency, but it's a cross-media, cross-cutting program. So it affects drinking water, surface water, waste management, and to some degree, air pollution as well.
And then at the end, you're going to tell us how you stay positive.
I'm going to work on it, right? Calluses, thick calluses. So this is the PFAS overview portion. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, like, what is PFAS, right? It's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And they're basically a class of chemicals that we estimate there are around 14,000 different PFAS chemistries that are out circulating in the environment, in the world, right? There are a much smaller subset of those that are commonly in use in an industrial setting. So why do we care about PFAS? Well, PFAS have the following adverse health risks. They're tied to increased risks of cancer, damaging your immune system, impacting reproductive health and the ability to both have pregnancies and then have healthy children and young infants. And then they're also they're tied to developmental delays. So both delays from a low birth weight and bone variations, but also accelerated puberty. I mean, the risks from PFAS and specifically PFOA and PFOS, which are two of the sort of first PFAS that we started dealing with, are expected to occur much below our ability to actually detect those contaminants. So this is fairly bad stuff. As you know, so I'm about ready to go over it. It's used a lot. And we're trying to now manage the issue now that we've gotten there. So what are PFAS? So they're basically chemically and physically stable, which means they don't break down. That's one of the reasons they have a lot of uses. And they're used in products because they're resistant to heat, resistant to water, and resistant to oils and sort of staining. They were discovered in the 1930s and basically have been in common use since the 1950s. They're in products that, you know, you would think of, it's used brand names, but the ones we all tie to it, like Teflon or Scotchgard, right? Like those are sort of some of the two products that are commonly associated with PFAS. And they're in things like cookware, cleaning products, food packaging, water and stain resistant everything, clothes, carpets, furniture, anything that has a stain resistance or oil resistance function probably has a perfluorinated compound associated with it to facilitate that. Electronics, renewable energy, it's in batteries, solar panels, heat pumps, medicines and medical devices, firefighting foams, and unfortunately, it's in a lot of other things that I, we can't go through, and we will go through a little bit in the end of the testimony. Because of this sort of ubiquity throughout all of these products, it creates a real issue. And I just pause for a second, sort of deviate. There are two things I think are important to sort of contextually know. One is that when we first started this journey into PFASs in 2016, we were dealing with strictly sort of with industrial sources where there was a manufacturer who was emitting PFASs into the environment. We were trying to respond to those releases. And the most significant one was in Bennington from the Chemfab Saint-Gobain facilities. But as we've sort of branched out, and we'll talk about in more detail, most of the PFAS exposure that we have in this state comes from each individual person's use of clothing, cleaning products, and other things that end up going into your septic system or wastewater system that ends up getting discharged out to the environment. And that's probably the most prominent source of PFAS contamination in the state of Vermont. So that's sort of one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is we call these things, so we call PFAS, they're in a sort of broader sort of umbrella of things that we call emerging contaminants. And the reason we call them emerging contaminants is because it feels like almost on a monthly basis, we're learning more about the fate of these chemicals in the environment, what they're used in, how to test for them. Basically, the science is evolving at an incredibly rapid rate, both in our understanding of what they are and how to test for them and manage them, what the risks are and how to treat them. And so it's not like some of the things that have been the sort of historic contaminants that we kind of know what's going on. We're learning regularly, and frankly, there's a lot of research that's going on right now that's evolving our understanding of perfluorinated compounds. So I went over this a little, and I guess I just also want to say, please feel free to raise your hand and stop me and ask any questions at any time during the presentation. I'm happy to just sort of pause and we can talk about any specific thing. So our first foray, like I said.
If I may.
Yes, please.
I would love for there are two members from our Human Services Committee joining us today because they worked on some PFAS bills in that committee last year. So I just actually take a moment. If you all want to introduce yourselves and if you have questions, we're encouraging folks to ask questions at the end of presentations so that, something that's going to come up later. Anyway, but go ahead if you would.
My name is Sam Eastis. I serve Guilford and Representative Eric McGuire, Rutland City. Thank you.
Excellent.
Great. Thank
Will we get these slides?
You will.
Okay.
Annika will
I
post
don't
them.
know how many notes to take, but
You already.
Yes, Annika has
Got 'em
them.
up.
They should. They were a little late, admittedly, and I apologize.
Thank you.
So let me just sort of the thing that, and I believe I've linked, there are lots of links in this presentation too, as we go through. So to the extent you want to dive in and read sort of source material, that source material has been linked in various areas. So for those who want to depress themselves more, there's an opportunity to do so. So the PFAS roadmap, I mean, you see the sort of 4 boxes or sort of the larger categories of things that we're sort of looking for. It's sort of reduce PFAS in commercial products and industrial uses, identify what the sources of PFAS are in the state of Vermont, protect Vermonters from existing uses either through treatment or through other sorts of means. And then I encourage EPA to basically continue its core role of being, frankly, a resource for states on sort of the research and sort of testing end of things. So some of the key sort of source identification work that we've done, just sort of to dive into things. So we've done, and each one of these I'll sort of break out in much greater detail as we sort of go through. We've done a significant amount of testing in private water supplies. We have one of the things that we as a state have tried to do is to get an understanding of the prevalence and scope of what contamination exists in the state, sort of outside of a sort of identified contaminant source. So we conducted a 500 residents well testing program, sort of randomly plotted throughout the state. So it was statistically valid to look at sort of what groundwater conditions are. The legislature thankfully gave us funding to help both pay for some of that testing, but also if we found issues to install POETs, which are point of entry treatment systems. They're sort of a carbon treatment unit that goes into the water coming into the house so that all the water in the house is treated. And then conduct sort of where we found, I'm going to call them hotspots, where there are potentially one or more PFAS sources that are problematic. We sort of expanded our investigation of those areas.
And Matt's slides are up now under his name for today.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
So we've also been looking at strategies to address PFAS in municipal wastewater. So we've tested the effluent at every publicly owned treatment works, or POTW. We've required industrial discharges to begin monitoring for PFAS. We've required pre-treatment discharges from metal finishers, which are kind of a problem, but actually less than we thought they would be. That's, I guess, actually a good news is in Vermont, metal finishers are not using PFAS like they are in other jurisdictions. And we are also monitoring and managing discharges from landfills. And then the last thing is in 2022, we applied for and obtained an EPA pollution prevention grant that basically is allowing us to go out and test both the land where compost digestate from anaerobic digesters and slurries from depackagers are being land applied to basically look for both PFAS and microplastics, but we're also looking upstream at the packaging that several Vermont businesses are using who volunteered to sort of participate in this program to say, okay, does your packaging have, or is it likely to have PFAS in it or produce microplastics sort of during its life? And how can we basically give you advice on how to reduce PFAS usage? How can we screen for things to basically reduce the amount of risk associated with that packaging? So that the first part, the packaging part of that report, literally I had the presentation from the consultant who did the work yesterday, and it should be posted on our website this week, and I'm happy to share that with folks.
Can you give us an example of industrial discharge?
So, I think a good example is, well, like a semiconductor manufacturer who has a direct discharge to a river as opposed to someone. And I guess I would also say there are lots of places like metal finishers or other sort of businesses that have discharges to wastewater treatment facilities. So when you have let me just use the easiest example, and it's not PFAS related. When you have a beer manufacturer, you have high levels of BOD, right? Going into your wastewater treatment facility. You're like, so for example, if I own a place and I discharge to a wastewater treatment facility, I have to pre-treat that discharge before it goes to the wastewater treatment facility so it doesn't damage the wastewater treatment facility because of the high strength nature of that waste. The same is true with some PFAS discharges, right? There are some, we were, I think, hopeful that when we looked at this problem, we would be able to solve it by looking at industrial sectors that might use PFAS and just slap treatment on their discharges prior to them discharging to a wastewater treatment facility. Unfortunately, that has not been the case. So now I'm going to go a little more in depth on PFAS and drinking water. and talk about some emerging regulatory issues and sort of what we've found in the state in drinking water. So in April of this last year, the US EPA adopted primary drinking water regulations for 6 PFAS. So they're basically, it's actually 5 PFAS, and then they did what's called a hazard index which is basically, it's a mix, how you look at mixtures. So mixtures of different PFAS compounds. So you'll see, they set the standards you can see up there. It's PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS, PFNA, and then it's HFPO/DA, which is what they call the Gen X compounds. But basically, these are the pretty common PFAS compounds that we've been focused on to this point out of those 14,000 PFAS compounds that are out there. So, and so folks know, on November 27th of last year, DEC has proposed to update the Vermont water supply rule to basically adopt the federal rule as Vermont standard. So right now, today, Vermont has an MCL for a slightly different list of PFAS. Everything that's there, except for the Gen X chemicals, 20 parts per trillion combined. So this is different. It's partially based the science that has been developed by EPA over the past several years that basically shows PFAS, and specifically PFOA and PFOS, are much more harmful than we thought they were. The 4 part per trillion standard basically represents the limits of our ability to detect PFAS. We expect the risk exists below that concentration.
Yeah, Representative Tagliavia.
Maybe I missed it. Can you tell us what MCLs are?
I'm sorry. Yes. So MCLs are the standards that exist for public drinking water systems. So for your communities that have 25 or more persons who are drinking from sort of a municipal source, that is the testing and sort of treatment standard that applies for those public drinking water systems.
It's minimum.
They're basically the minimum. If you have any concentration over those numbers, then you need to
Minimum
treat it.
concentration.
That's
Right.
Okay.
You need to treat for PFAS. And so we are in the process, frankly, I think our comment period, we've had 2 public meetings on that rule. Our comment period is coming to a close, and we should be adopting the federal sort of framework within the next several months. So this sort of so sort of 2 columns here. One is the public water systems column. We've tested 620 public water systems in the state of Vermont. Of those 620, 19 have exceeded our today's standard, the 20 parts per billion for PFOA, PFOS, et cetera. And we project based on the data that when this standard changes, 93 system, well, let me actually back off. 93 systems have detectable levels of a regulated PFAS. So they have below standards, but some detectable level.
Since that standard is sort of based on our minimum ability to detect, you're gonna, yeah, I get it.
You're at a heightened risk, yeah. And then on the other side of the column is the private water supply. 40% of Vermont's drinking water comes through private water supplies. As a part of a sampling effort, we'd sampled 514 wells. 2% exceed today's standard. 4% will exceed the standard we're about ready to adopt, the sort of federal standard. And 23% have detectable levels of PFAS.
Are those located in particular areas, or were you surprised at their geographic distribution?
Well, so it was intentionally, it was intended to be geographically dispersed, right? Sort of as a randomized scatter plot across the state of Vermont. We I don't want to get too deep into statistics, but we did stratify it for places based on high density versus sort of rural areas. So we did want to have a better appreciation whether we would see higher PFAS concentrations where we had village centers with just septic, for example, right? Because both New York and other states have put out studies that show septic is a source to contaminating drinking water wells. So we did that to try and look deeper into whether we were seeing something where there's more density taking place. And the answer is that I wasn't extremely surprised by these results. This is fairly consistent with what other jurisdictions are seeing with respect to PFAS contamination.
But you did not see a geographic.
Well, so through this process, we've definitely, and I'll just share some information. I mean, we certainly have seen like hotspots in various areas where we've focused attention and basically are now saying, okay, let's expand sort of the circle of wells that we're testing. And so there are areas in Swanton, in Bennington, and in Shaftesbury where we're expanding sort of our investigations. I think it's safe for me to say that the Bennington, Shaftesbury, we believe that that is a continuation of the issues that we saw with Saint-Gobain and ChemFab. So that is out there. And you know, we continue to sort of right for sources anytime we see something that's exceeding a standard, we try and look to see whether there's a source or whether we're just dealing with a septic contribution to a polluting a well.
Representative Chapin.
So I'm sorry, I just didn't quite hear the answer to the Chair's question about, did you find that did you find a pattern that septics were, that pattern that you thought you would find around septic contamination?
So no, and not that we didn't find it. I think we haven't, this study wasn't necessarily designed to show a connection between septic and wells, right? It was really to look at sort of the prevalence of the problem statewide and the scope of the problem statewide. And for us to then think about a number of different, it allowed us to frankly focus our efforts on areas where we thought we might have a contamination source, right? So to sort of zone in on the person who's responsible and have them fix that impact. It also helps us to give us and the health department to give guidance to Vermonters on what they should be doing based on sort of the significance of the problem that we see. And that was sort of what it was designed for.
Yeah, I understand it wasn't
Yeah,
designed for this, but if you saw some patterns that you're interested in further exploring, I think that's what we're trying to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to draw tighter, get a better understanding, draw a series of tighter connections between the relationship between septic and releases to drinking water. That's it's a challenge. I guess I'll just say, and I'm really probably getting a little in the weeds. One of the things that I'm not sure if it's the next. Well, I think I can talk about it here. One of the things for those, we have something called the groundwater protection rule. It's basically the rule that covers both permitted discharges and sort of the cleanup level for contaminated sites. We're in the process right now of sort of starting a rule amendment with that groundwater protection rule to mirror the federal MCL. One of the things that we're likely going to do sort of like adjacent to that rule is looking to expand the number of hotspots for purposes of stormwater infiltration to make sure that stormwater infiltration isn't impacting groundwater from PFAS sort of deposition. And also looking at the UIC program, which is basically contaminant discharges to groundwater, and basically creating a set of functionally hotspots for wastewater systems, right? So if you are in an industry that is likely to have, like, say, for example, to use floor waxes, we're going to say either you need to not put those into your septic system and sort of manage them separately when you strip your floor wax and re-wax your floors, or you need to get a special permit. So
Or use a different floor wax.
Hmm?
Or use a different floor wax.
Or not wax your floors.
Just to,
yeah,
I would just love to see like a map of those and just can you just share a
I
report?
think we have, yes, I think we can share a map of that.
I don't want to misinterpret it, but I'd just be curious.
Yes.
Representative Tagliavini.
With regard to the wells and septics, the studies you did finding the different concentrations of PFAS, did the studies take note of soil types, and were different soil types affected?
So the relationship between soil type and groundwater impact is there's a strong relationship between those two things. And this is frankly, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a geologist, right? And so this is where we start getting to the point where it's probably better if we want to dive into detail, that I get some people who are more technically sort of savvy than I am on this. But I can tell you that basically PFAS is very attracted to organic matter at its simplest level, right? Which is why carbon filtration is a great way to sort of deal with PFAS. So depending on the soil and certain soil characteristics, there are some soils that PFAS binds to better, and there are some that basically it releases from easier. And, soil depth, soil type, and other soil characteristics all kind of go into our thought process around what we might see from PFAS flushing out of those soils and into groundwater.
I think so.
Sorry, this is
If I understand you correctly, sandier soils are less likely to bind it.
and it's more likely to go, like, if you have like a deposition or a septic system, it's more likely to just pass through and hit groundwater. Yes, I think generally speaking, and that's at its most simple level, and I will warn you, this is like the complex stuff. That is at its most simple level, the case.
Representative Austin.
Yeah, I'm just kind of backing way up. Is there now regulation against creating anything that is used,
We're gonna get
You're
there.
gonna get there.
Yeah. No, that's sort of part two of the program, but
figure out how this happened?
But I mean, I think that, your question is directly on point. I mean, from our strategy, like our sort of larger view, the area where Vermont could do the best and the most work is at the restricting its use in consumer products. Because once we've actually hit the point where we're dealing with it in wastewater treatment facilities or in septic systems or in drinking water systems, treatment is incredibly difficult and expensive, right? And so it's trying to basically send signals to get this material out of consumer products in the first instance is really the management key, and not dealing with it on sort of the back end.
But are there other kind of things like PFAS that we don't know about, that we're not even aware of, that could be being put? Is there a way to figure that out?
So, I mean,
That's a big one. We might pause it, although I would
Okay.
just ask Matt if you could speak a couple of, I think it would help the committee understand the context of Representative Austin's question. If you could explain how in this country we do or do not regulate chemical contaminations at the
so
highest level.
at the highest level, and not driving into a whole lot of detail, we have a fractured system, chemical management within the United States. Food and drugs is managed different than pesticides, which is managed different than everything else, right? And basically, unlike the EU that has much more comprehensive controls on chemicals before they get out into commerce. The US has the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is not as robust as the way the EU handles chemical management. But I mean, I think it's safe to say, even in the EU, there are emerging contaminants that are out there in products that we don't have a firm grip on their toxicity or impacts to the environment.
Thank you.
And the Toxic Substances Control Act, you will hear referred to as TSCA
Yes.
sometimes. Representative Bartholomew.
Innocent until proven guilty.
Yeah, I was gonna go there with you. Thank you. I think that's accurate.
I think
In this country, it's a little inverted. In the EU, they need to show that before something goes onto the market, they actually need to show some level of it not doing harm. In this country, we allow things generally to go on the market until they are known to cause harm. So it's kind of inverted.
And then we pay to clean it up.
All right, so I'm gonna transition to PFAS and surface water. And I'm probably gonna go through this fairly quickly, and just because we're starting to, EPA has issued an aquatic life criteria for PFAS, and I'm not an expert in this. And if you want to talk about surface water and PFAS, Director Laflamme is really the person to have in, and he can talk to you about the efforts that are ongoing with respect to surface water and PFAS. But I think it's good to know that we have an in-stream, in-water body surface water monitoring program for PFAS. We have a robust data set from that perspective. I don't think that we've seen things that are of significant concern. We have a fish tissue monitoring program that DEC and Fish and Wildlife undertake together. I mean, yeah, the science, again, I will say the science is constantly evolving. I don't think that we've seen significant concerns with respect to that, but we also don't have a fish consumption sort of advisory or standard for this. So doing a quick sort of what we know on PFAS and wastewater systems, for POTWs, so sort of your municipal wastewater treatment system, Vermont has tested both the influent and effluent quarterly at all of those systems.
Just say what POTW is.
Yes, it's a publicly owned treatment works, which is basically your municipal wastewater system. And your average influent at a wastewater treatment facility is 26 parts per trillion, and your average effluent is 68 parts per trillion. And you're probably wondering, why are those numbers different? And how can the effluent be greater than the influent? And so we don't know, right? I will say I think that to some degree, I think we're working under an assumption that the processes within a wastewater treatment system are causing PFAS that we can't see with our existing analytical capacity to break down to the PFAS we can see with our existing analytical capacity. So you're seeing chemical changes taking place through the wastewater treatment process to these PFASs, causing them to basically change into other PFASs.
Are there chemicals used at wastewater treatment plants?
Not that we would, so we don't think there's the addition of chemicals that are sort of the fluorinated chemicals that would cause these sorts of changes. We don't think so.
Representative Tagliavia.
Can you tell me what the pH of the influence is versus the pH of the effluent is?
Someone can, but not me. And I'm happy to get that information to you.
The reason I ask is because in certain chemicals, when you lower the pH, you draw them out. Why?
I mean, so we know that there's a series of chemical reactions that are taking place within wastewater treatment facilities. Well, let me actually back up even more. We know that PFASs break down to what we call terminal PFASs. And it's, again, I'm a lawyer, not a chemist, right? But basically the PFASs are sort of like gravitating towards some of these PFASs that we can see. We have some sampling methods that can sort of unnaturally force that sort of conversion from things we can't see to things we can see. So you wouldn't expect the analytical method to actually occur, say, in a wastewater treatment plant, but we can sort of force it so that we can see things. And we know that there are PFASs. Right now we can test, and again, taking a step back and giving some context. There's a lot here, and so I apologize if I'm so we can currently test for around, and this changes regularly, 48 different PFAS compounds. And like I said, there are 14,000 of them out there. So we can see about 48 of them. We can force some of these chemical reactions to have them break down into things that we can see. And we think that some of those chemical reactions are taking place just sort of like as a part of the wastewater treatment process, right? And we see it in other sort of processes too, right? Like they just tend to break into different PFAS compounds. So I'm not sure it's a pH issue. It's a complex organic sort of interaction that's taking place.
I'm curious if causing these to break down is actually making them more toxic, more dangerous. Is there a comparison? Is there any kind of research to show that? Are we better off leaving them the way they are before they're treated, oxidized, or however they're treated?
You know, I will look into that and get back to you. There may be some research out there. I'm not aware of any, like as we say.
The reason I ask is the influence safer than the effluent?
Well, I mean, again, you wouldn't want to, I mean, part of the challenge is the influent that's coming in is raw sewage and the effluent is treated sewage, right? So
the influence, I mean, influent from a PFAS standpoint, not this.
Oh, no, I understand. I understand. I mean, I understand. So, and then, so I think the other sort of like interesting thing, at least from my perspective, is several years ago, we tested basically this sewer infrastructure into Vermont municipalities. So we basically went up into the collection system, went to manholes, tested at those sort of pump stations in manholes where we could access the sewage, and then saw where we were seeing the highest concentrations of PFAS loading from. And it was from the residential sectors of the communities, not where their industrial parks were, not where, you know, sort of things that so that the mass contribution is primarily coming from residential. Frankly, it's coming from our laundries and from our cleaners and from our dishwashers. All right, so switching topics to PFAS and regulated wastes. Land application. So we talked about, so the last slide was about POTWs and the liquid discharge from a sort of municipal wastewater treatment facility. This is about the solid waste component at a municipal wastewater treatment facility. So every municipal wastewater treatment facility has a sludge that it develops when they go through and they treat wastewater. And you have to manage that sludge in some way. You basically have three options today to manage your sludge. You can landfill it, you can incinerate it, or you can land apply it. So use it as an agronomic. So basically starting in 2019, we have tested, well,
We don't incinerate in the state.
I don't think we have any, well, we don't have any incinerators in this state, and I don't think we're shipping any material to an incinerator in other jurisdictions. So in 2019, but we've tested all sewage sludges from wastewater treatment facilities as a part of the work that we've done. And we've started testing, let me again, sort of context. So biosolids are basically divided into two classes as far as how you manage them. There's class B, which are basically ones that ANR permits when they go onto a field, right? Like, so if you're a town and you want to manage your municipal sludges by getting a permit and land apply them on a field that is used for hay, You can do that. There are a whole bunch of criteria in our rules for how you do that, and you need to get a permit from us. There's also what we call Class A, or exceptional quality biosolids, which really are, they've been treated to significantly reduce the pathogen load in those biosolids. And there's also metals and other chemicals that you have to meet certain lower standards for. From a federal level, this time, you don't have to look at PFAS. Vermont requires that all those be tested for PFAS. In 2019, we started testing soils of all of our Class B facilities. Basically, if we detected PFAS above the Vermont standard, the 20 part per trillion standard, then we tested all drinking water supplies within a quarter mile and closed the site for any sort of future land application. As you can see, the number of active permits that we have has dropped from 14 at that time to 4. Some of those are just because it's hard. People are phasing out doing this, but some of them are because we found sites that have on-site groundwater contamination that caused us to say it's time to stop doing this activity on these fields.
So is it fair to say that a significant amount of septic more is going to our landfill?
So a significant amount. So they also have the Class A option, right? Which is the sort of higher treatment option. There are companies, both Casella and a company in New Hampshire, who broker and manage biosolids for municipalities, and they basically will take it for you and either create a manufactured topsoil or other sort of soil amendment that is used in more industrial settings as opposed to residential settings. We'll actually talk about this in a second too. And let's just go there. So in 2024, Vermont basically adopted what we call the interim strategy for managing biosolids. And this strategy primarily dealt with Class A biosolids. So those ones that weren't covered by a permit. Historically, we've said that both EPA and the state have functionally said that those are exempt. That's over now. We basically have said if you have PFAS concentrations that are above our background levels, you have to meet a series of siting requirements and do a significant amount of additional testing, both where they're being applied, on the material, and so forth. So that policy is in effect, and it's operating sort of in a sort of interim policy-based status. We're planning on incorporating it into our solid waste rules this spring. I guess the other thing just to share, and I provided it, EPA issued a human health risk assessment on biosolids literally a week ago today, and we're in the process of sort of digesting that. I wish EPA had said, if biosolids have a PFAS concentration greater than X, you shouldn't use them. That's not what they did. They provided a whole bunch of different scenarios and talked about the risk associated with each one of those scenarios. And so both us and the Agency of Agriculture are sort of digging through that risk assessment and trying to figure out what the best policy recommendations are for the state of Vermont. I will say some of the policy recommendations that EPA had sort of proposed, we're already doing them, right? Like, so we've sort of done the base of what EPA is proposing to do. I think now we're looking about whether we should go any further than what EPA is recommending. So.
Just a quick question. That
Yes, please.
interim strategy for the management of biosolids in the state, was that legislation from the legislature, or was that something that the ANR came up with?
It was A&R. I mean, we basically looked at the data that we had and saw that this was a risk. And, you know, the risk exists as much in sort of the Class A as the Class B. I mean, the treatment processes that we use on biosolids don't eliminate PFAS, right? So, you know, I think our real goal is, you know, we're a risk management, not a risk elimination. We try and make sure that we're protecting people from being exposed to PFAS, while at the same time, we have a waste stream that's kind of difficult to manage, and we have to find a way to manage it. So what are the right risk? What are we, and this is an ANR sort of policy question. What's the risk that we think is acceptable? And that's what this policy says. We're going to isolate this material. We're not going to allow it to be sort of loaded up on the ground because loading is a problem, right? Like, so, and we're going to test, you know, drinking water and other, sort of, yeah, we're going to tell you, you can't put it close to any drinking water sources. And then we're going to test things afterwards.
But isn't isolation and not loading somewhat contradictory?
Well, so you don't want to, I mean, I think that at least right now, and again, we're in the process of assessing new information that just came out last week, and this may all change based on that new information. But I think that using a manufactured topsoil that has relatively low levels of PFAS in a road construction project, building an embankment that doesn't have private drinking water supplies anywhere near that road project, it's probably a fine use of that manufactured topsoil. Probably a better use than taking prime ag soils off the ag land for that road embankment in order to establish vegetation. So those are the sorts of challenges. I mean, one other jurisdiction has stopped land application of biosolids in the state of Maine. It's not been a successful policy in Maine. So,
So Matt, I'm seeing that you have a lot of slides remaining.
I know, I'm gonna,
Time remaining?
you know what,
I get, and what I'm gonna propose is that we have you back.
all right, I can do that.
We need this and we just didn't give you enough time. And so I would, rather than rush you, I would like to do that. And so as you kind of find the right place to put.
There's a logical break point, so, so let me go through landfills. So we have one active landfill in the state of Vermont. That's the New England Waste Services of Vermont landfill in Coventry. Everybody should know they have a treatment system that they are currently using to treat leachate at that landfill that is incredible. It's a very effective treatment system. It's basically, I think, they're still in the pilot phase and they're trying to calibrate it. We've seen reduction of up to 90% of the PFAS that is in the leachate from the treatment system.
Has that been about a year?
Well, there have been various legal and other issues that have slowed down the treatment system from being up and sort of working and running through its pilot and demonstration phase. I mean, the way the wastewater permit is set up is that there's a pilot phase to basically demonstrate the efficacy of the treatment system. And assuming everyone agrees it works well, it'll be incorporated into the pre-treatment permit at that facility. We just started the pilot phase, and there may be other issues with it based off. There was an Act 250 jurisdictional opinion that came out that said they needed an Act 250 permit that they don't have. So they may have to stop again.
And so when you say pilot, is it 100% of the effluent being treated in the pilot or some portion?
I think that they're trying to treat as much of the effluent as they can through the system that they have. It may not be 100%. Part of this is that right now they're operating in a closed loop environment. So there's an open loop. I mean, again, not to dive too deep into it, but the way the treatment system is functioning, it can handle less capacity right now. So they're also, just so folks are aware, they're looking to pilot other sort of destruction technologies up there. So this is a treatment, but they're also looking at various destruction technologies that are innovative to potentially look at. And I like including this report, this graph from a report, because I think it helps to visualize for people like what the PFAS load is going to a landfill. Textiles, carpet, and what we call bulky waste, which is basically furniture and other things like that, are by mass, by and far and away the largest sources of PFAS to landfill. Things like sludges or commercial and demolition waste are pretty low concentration materials.
So I'm sorry, what is this estimated mass? But obviously those things would weigh more. But is it the concentration of PFAS?
That is my understanding, yes. Yes.
Massive PFAS, not massive the material.
Right, it's a PFAS max.
The Y Act.
Lux.
So I'm gonna go again, knowing there's a little bit of time. I mean, some of the things that we've done, I mean, this is sort of a list of things that we've either done or are doing to basically reduce Vermonters' exposure. We've developed laboratory capacity in consultation with the Agency of Agriculture. So the Vail Lab now has the ability, they've just started being able to treat for, or excuse me, test for PFAS. I mean, this list of things are things that we developed as a part of our 2023 PFAS roadmap. A lot of them have actually already been done, which is, I guess, good news, and you would like to see that. So a few of them, like Vermont water quality standards, we're still sort of like working through the best way to approach surface water management of PFAS. I think most of this we have gone over. I mean, I think it's worth also just sort of noting for the committee. I mean, the state of Vermont has brought a lawsuit against 3M and DuPont for the impacts that they have had on the state of Vermont because they knew of the adverse risks associated with PFAS and failed to warn or disclose the state of those risks and put them out into commerce. And
they've known for decades,
they have known for decades. They have known for a long time.
from the beginning, potentially.
Certainly for a very long time.
Mm.
Certainly for a very long time. And then, you know, we're certainly continuing to encourage EPA to continue its role as a science leader in the space of helping us understand how to manage PFAS and also, frankly, encouraging them to use TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, to restrict or ban PFAS, a lot of these PFASs. I mean, it's great to try and take action as a state, but it would be much better for the federal government to take action. It continue its work on researching health effects of PFAS compounds. Again, we have there are 14,000 of these compounds out there. We have an understanding of a very small number of what their impacts are on human health. I mean, I think it's fair to say that there really is not a good PFAS. Expand our ability to actually test PFASs. Again, we can test for about 40 some odd PFASs out of the 14,000. And then increase our understanding and give us guidance on what we need to do with respect to disposal and destruction of PFAS. I mean, we're still at the very early stages of managing PFAS destruction. There's just not a lot of guidance out there. So I think this is a logical sort of breaking point in my testimony. If there are any questions on sort of where we're at with respect to sort of the broad picture PFAS management, and then just to foreshadow, the next step is where the consumer products legislation and frankly, what we're hoping to do to further reduce the amount of PFAS out in the environment and how to manage PFAS.
I guess I would ask if you maybe would do the next slide, which is what we've already done, and then we'll
Yeah,
set up for
absolutely. That's actually,
you to come in for the report.
yes. So basically, this is what we've already done as a state. So as far as phasing PFAS out of consumer products, and in 2021, we passed Act 36, and it eliminated PFAS from firefighting foam, direct contact, food packaging, rugs, carpets, aftermarket water resistant treatments, and ski wax. So those are all, and in the parentheticals on all of this, that's their effective dates, just so you have an understanding of a lot of these. What we do is we pass them and we give industry some time to either get the material off the shelves or sort of phase things out. And then for firefighter turnout gear, there's a requirement that was passed for providing firefighters notice that there's PFAS in their turnout gear. Based on my research and others' research, I don't think there's an alternative for firefighter turnout gear, an alternative to PFAS. So, and then in last year in 2023, we passed Act 131, which phases out PFAS in cosmetics and menstrual products, adult mattresses, apparel, artificial turf, cookware, incontinency protection products, juvenile products, and textiles.
So many questions. It's very exciting because you set yourself up for your next presentation.
I mean, I think, I guess, you know, to sort of leave on the note of not complete doom and gloom. I mean, I do think that there are meaningful steps that we can take as a state to reduce PFAS in the environment. And I think that, you know, we're doing a lot. There are a lot of other jurisdictions, especially in the Northeast, who are sort of pushing things forward as far as figuring out what the significant contributors PFAS are going out into the environment and trying to figure out innovative ways, both regulatorily and otherwise, to deal with them. So I don't think it is all doom and gloom. And I think that there's a common agreement. I don't even think like businesses don't want PFAS in their products. They are trying to find ways to phase it out themselves. So this is helping to send signals to them that it's time.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And we will find a time as soon as possible to have you back for the presentation of the report.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And members, we will take a 5-minute break before our next agenda item.